Today is Friday, September 10th, and welcome to the Fall 2021 lecture series, History Bites, sponsored by the Amherst, Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is George Naughton, and for our first lecture in the series, we're hosting Mr. Robert McMaster, who will talk about his new book, which is a biography of Edward Hitchcock. So Edward Hitchcock was one of the most eminent American scientists of his time, a popular professor and president of Amherst College, and an inspiring preacher. But nearly 160 years after his death, his story has never been told. So in his new book, All the Light Here Comes from Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock, Williamsburg author Robert T. McMaster at last brings to light the many facets of one of this state's and nation's most famous sons. Relying largely on Hitchcock's own words from his letters, notes, and other unpublished manuscripts, McMaster presents an intimate view of the man, his scientific achievements, and his theological writings, as well as his battles with powerful personal demons that threatened him at every turn. Every chapter of his book is introduced with a vignette, a scene from the life of Edward Hitchcock or his family that reveals the humanity of the man with dignity, charm, and humor. And our speaker today, Mr. Robert McMaster, is a former biology professor at Holyoke Community College. And he's also the author of a trio of historical novels known as the Trolley Days series, set in the Holyoke, Springfield, Westfield area in the early 20th century. A man of many talents. So please welcome Robert McMaster.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, George. Thank you to the Amherst Historical Society, Amherst Media, and of course, all of you folks who are tuning in today. Western Massachusetts, I'm sure you'd agree, especially people that live in these parts, Western Massachusetts has more than its share of historical figures who have become icons. Amherst, of course, has this lady who needs no introduction. South Hadley has Mary Lyon, who was a pioneer in women's higher education. And Northampton has Jonathan Edwards, who warned his parishioners to tend to their souls lest they fall into the hands of an angry God. And then there is this man, Edward Hitchcock, poet, playwright, professor, paleontologist, preacher, and college president. He was, as George said, one of the most influential scientists of 19th century America. Now, Emily Dickinson has had some 24 biographies written of her. Jonathan Edwards, almost as many, and Mary Lyon has had a few. But I was surprised to learn some years ago that no biography had ever been written for Edward Hitchcock. And so in 2017, I began this project. And now in 2021, as George said, my book is in print. It's entitled All the Light Here Comes from Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock. Today, I'll share with you some of the insights I've gained from this into this fascinating man, some of the lesser known episodes of his life, and some of the dimensions of the man that have evaded public scrutiny. I'll concentrate on Edwards and Orr's Amherst years, but at the end, I will address what I believe are the major elements, the bigger picture of the legacy of Edward Hitchcock. He was born in Deerfield in 1793, the last of 5 children born to Mercy Hoyt Hitchcock and Justin Hitchcock. They grew up in this house, which still stands today, and they attended Deerfield Academy. In fact, 2 of Edward's older siblings were in the very first class to enter Deerfield Academy in January of 1799. Edward himself attended Deerfield Academy for parts of 6 years, from 1804 to 1809. And that, believe it or not, was the extent of Edward Hitchcock's formal education. Well, just 7 years after he left Deerfield Academy as a student, he returned as the headmaster. They called it preceptor in those days. And he was assisted by Miss Ora White, a native of Amherst, a very, very well-educated and intelligent young woman, gifted in the decorative arts, as they said in those days, as well as in mathematics and science. And that portrait is not literally of Ora, because there is none of Ora as a young woman, but it's a portrait that she drew of a young woman at that time. So Edward and Ora became colleagues and friends, but when Edward left just 2 years later, his farewell address hints that their relationship had grown. He said, "In these sentiments and feelings, Miss White desires to join with me, and we beg you to accept our hearty thanks for the gratification we received in instructing those who have had disposition and ability to advance in knowledge." So he was already thinking of Ora as something more than just a colleague and more than just a friend. And he left Deerfield. He was, so far as I can tell, he was dismissed from Deerfield, not due to any shortcoming on his part, but because the academy was in dire straits at the time and would soon close its doors temporarily. And I also want to point out at this point how indebted I am to Amherst College archives, and also to the Deerfield, historic Deerfield, and the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association. Without them, I would never have been able to complete this project. Well, the following spring, Edward traveled to New Haven, and he sat in on classes by these two men. Professor Benjamin Silliman was a professor of geology and chemistry, and Professor Eleazar Fitch was a professor of theology. He was not an enrolled student, he was just auditing. Now, I should point out that back in Deerfield, Edward had undergone a rather significant religious conversion. He grew up in Deerfield, which was a Unitarian town, but in about 1816, he converted to Calvinism, what they called in that day Orthodox Christianity, and we might call today Christian fundamentalism, faith that emphasizes the personal relationship between a believer and his God, repentance of one's sin, and renewal of one's heart in order to achieve salvation. And that conversion, he explained many years later, was largely due to the influence of Ora White. Yale at the time was strongly influenced by Orthodox Christianity. Harvard was Unitarian, bad. Yale was Orthodox Christianity or Calvinism. And that shouldn't come as any surprise, because the president of Yale at the time was Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. Just 2 months into his time at Yale, Edward was invited to preach a sermon, his first sermon ever. It was in a church in West Haven. And after preaching that sermon, he wrote in his notes, "Felt much solicitude, diffidence, and weakness in this first effort in the pulpit, but have much reason to be grateful that utterance was given me. I feel fearful that my lungs never will permit me to preach long should I live to complete my studies. But with God, all things are possible. Let me be humble. Let me be watchful." Well, I think we can say one thing for certain, and that is that Edward Hitchcock never suffered from a lack of utterance. Edward returned to Deerfield with a new voice and a new vocation. He was now Edward Hitchcock, itinerant preacher. And he, for the next 2 years, he traveled up and down the valley in a horse and buggy, there he goes there, filling in what they called pulpit supply for absent pastors. And he was very busy, as you can see, we have 37 sermons that he wrote during that time period. Who knows how many more have been lost? And he delivered over 100 sermons in those 2 years, which means 2 every Sunday, which was the normal for a church in those days. And you'll notice that he preached 4 times in Amherst, 9 times in Deerfield, 15 times in Brattleboro, but 30 times in Conway. Why all those sermons, all those Sundays in Conway? For the simple reason that Reverend John Emerson was nearly 70 years old and was in failing health. And sure enough, in April, I guess it was, of 1821, the Reverend Emerson announced to his congregation that he would need help. And they began a search for a junior pastor, and Edward Hitchcock's name very quickly came to the top of the pile there, shall we say. And he soon received the call to the Congregational Church in Conway. Orem, meanwhile, had left the Deerfield Academy. It had closed its doors in 1819 for several years. And she had secured a teaching position at Amherst Academy. And I'll bet many of you from Amherst know all about Amherst Academy. It was situated directly across the street from the Strong House and the Jones Library. So you can perhaps picture it. And there's an old photo of it and a map as well. And while she was there, she met Mary Lyon, one of her students, and that became a long-term friendship that had important consequences, as I'll speak about in a moment. Well, on the 30th of May, Edward Hitchcock and Miss Ora White were married, of all places in a tavern. Can you imagine? I'd like to know the story of why they were married in a tavern, but in any case, it was located, according to several sources, at the corner of North Pleasant Street and Amity Street, right about there. And so the couple headed off to Conway to start their married life together. Just a few weeks later, Edward was ordained. And a few days after that, I believe it was June 23rd or 24th, he preached his first sermon as the junior pastor of the Conway Congregational Church. The couple lived in this house, which still stands today on Whately Road in Conway. Their time in Conway would be relatively short, only a little over 4 years. In October of 1825, Edward resigned his post. Why did he resign? Well, ostensibly, it was because of poor health. At least that's what he told his congregation. But the couple had lost a 2-year-old son, little Edward, and you can tell from reading his personal notes that it became very painful to them living in Conway after the loss of that little boy. So that may have played a role as well. But I believe the main reason for his departure was that Edward found much more enjoyment and fulfillment in science, even in his years as a preacher. He published in those 4 years in Conway, he published some 20 scientific works on geology, botany, and even meteorology. And he received an offer of a faculty post at Amherst College. And so the die was cast and he announced his resignation. And you can tell that he harbored a great deal of guilt the rest of his life over having left his flock. Notice in his final sermon here in Conway, he said, "The account of my ministry in this place is now sealed up to the judgment of the great day. There I shall soon meet you all, and that account will be open to the everlasting joy of some and the everlasting grief of others." So he really felt like he'd abandoned his flock. Edward was on the faculty at Amherst College for 37 years, from 1826 and right up until his death in 1864. He taught chemistry, mineralogy, geology, natural history, botany, and Bible studies. Of course, Amherst College was only 4 years old at the time. It had been founded primarily for the purpose of training young men in the Christian ministry. So you can see how this must have seemed like a perfect alternative for Edward. It allowed him to this position. It allowed him to pursue his science, but also to some degree, continue his ministry. And he certainly did do a lot of preaching, as well as Bible classes and so on during his years at Amherst College. Geology, he taught 37 years in a row. It was, after all, his first love. He taught geology 37 years in a row, including the 9 years when he was president of Amherst College. And his last class ended in December of 1863, ended just a couple of months before his death. The couple had been living in a rented house up here on North Pleasant Street, maybe roughly where CVS Pharmacy is today. But they, in 1828, purchased this house, which anybody from Amherst will immediately recognize. It's on our college campus now. And Ora and Edward spent the rest of their days in that house, except for the 9 years of his presidency. And they raised all the rest of their children. I don't know if you can see it there, but there's Edward, Catherine, Jane, Emily, Charles. Starting in 1829, Edward kept what he called his private notes. It's kind of like a diary, but not nearly as regular as a diary. He would only make entries a few times a year often, but they were long entries and mostly to do with his spiritual development and his career. But what you learn from reading these is that in nearly every entry, Edward is talking about his poor health and his imminent death. In 1833, he wrote, "If his providence does not save me, I shall soon be in my grave." The next year, "Perhaps my present state of health is only a short respite from the grave." While he was president, he wrote, "The college will rise and flourish, but I must die soon." And in 1859, he wrote, "The probability is faint of my seeing another year, and I long to be prepared to go." Clearly, Edward Hitchcock was consumed, you might say obsessed, with his own death. And you might think that such a fixation on one's impending doom would have a depressing effect. But you know, it did not have that effect on Edward Hitchcock. It was quite the opposite. It seemed he used his belief in his impending death as an incentive, a motivation to get busy, to teach, to preach, to publish, to complete the work that God had set out for him. Far from depressing him, his desponding nature, as he called it, actually served as a powerful motivator to get on with life, to complete projects, even at times to take on new projects. And in 1830, he took on one huge project. In May of 1830, he wrote a letter to Governor Levi Lincoln proposing a geological survey of Massachusetts. Lincoln must have liked the idea because he sent it off to the legislature. They approved it. And within 30 days, Edward had the job. It was an enormous undertaking. That little dot there is showing you the route that he followed in just his first year. Just that first year, he traveled over 1,600 miles in 56 days and visited 158 towns, all in a horse-drawn wagon. And consider this is a man with a full-time job back in Amherst, a growing family, and a range of health problems. Over the next 3 years, he continued the survey and expanded it to all parts of the state. And in the end, traveled 135 days over 4 seasons and more than 3,000 miles, visited 266 cities and towns, and recorded 400 pages of notes and collected several thousand rock and mineral specimens. One goal of the project was to draw a geological map of the state, and that he did, as you can see. It was the most detailed geological map ever drawn of Massachusetts. It holds up very well, I think any geologist would say, compared to maps today. And remember that the technology available to Edward Hitchcock at that time was limited to what you see right over there on the left. A geologist's hammer was the extent of the technology at his disposal. Another purpose of the project was economic, and there I think it was less fruitful. For one thing, several of the major mineral resources of the state that he pointed out were already well known and being exploited. Granite, if you can see it there to the east, limestone to the west. So those were already being widely exploited and would for many years to come. But Edward also made some predictions that didn't pan out. For one, he reported in his 1833 report, the anthracite of Rhode Island, and even that of Worcester, will be considered by posterity, if not by the present generation, as a treasure of great value. Well, I think you would agree that nobody ever made $1 mining coal in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. There's coal down there, there's definitely coal, but it is poor quality and it was never marketable. Edward also predicted that gold would be discovered in Hawley, Massachusetts, but to my knowledge, there was never a gold rush in Hawley. But there were some important benefits from very important benefits from Edward's geological surveys. One has to do with the evidence for Noah's flood. Like most scientists of his time, Hitchcock saw much of the surface geology that he observed as diluvial, meaning a result of a flood, in particular, the great flood of Genesis, the flood of Noah and his ark. But two phenomena in particular struck his interest throughout Massachusetts and New England: diluvial grooves, as you see there, what we would call glacial striae today, and huge boulders far from their source, what we would call glacial erratics today. These challenged his assumptions about geological history and the Bible, as you'll see. He was particularly taken with those boulders. This is one he named the Green Mountain Giant because he believed it to be the largest one in the state of Vermont. I visited it just a little over a year ago, and I can attest to you that it is very large indeed. All over Massachusetts, he found trains of these boulders, like the one on the left. Watch that red dot, and perhaps you can see it moving from northwest to southeast. It represented a whole train of boulders, perhaps hundreds, even thousands, carried all from one source just over the state line in New York to the southeast, about 15 miles, ending in Tyringham, Massachusetts. And these just did not fit with the great flood of Genesis. And he wrote in his report in 1833, making every allowance for the reduction of the gravity of these boulders when in water, I confess I cannot conceive how such a work could have been effected by this agency. So he was clearly had serious doubts that any flood of any magnitude could cause those kinds of events. Well, that man, if you can see him, just a few years later, that was Louis Agassiz, published a very, very important work on continental glaciation. And in 1840, Edward Hitchcock was perhaps the first American geologist to embrace Agassiz's theories of continental glaciation. It didn't end there. Hitchcock and other American geologists hemmed and hawed and backpedaled on it for about 20 years. But Edward was one of the first to say, gee, this explains a lot. In 1844, the prospects for Amherst College had sunk very low. So low that it was very close to shuttering its doors. The college was mired in debt. Relationships between the faculty and students were fraught. In December of that year, the Board of Trustees called on Professor Edward Hitchcock as a last resort to take over the presidency of the college. Why Edward Hitchcock, a man with such physical and emotional baggage, we might say? The simple answer is that there was nobody else who wanted the job. And furthermore, everyone affiliated with the college, trustees, faculty, students, alumni, believed in Edward Hitchcock. Everyone except Edward Hitchcock. In his inaugural address, now picture the scene there, he's in the meeting house in Amherst. There's hundreds of students and dignitaries and townspeople gathered around, and he delivers this very long, meandering speech. But towards the end, he says, "But here it is right to confess that my judgment coincides with my feelings in the conclusion that I am unadapted to meet the present exigency." Well, how do you think that went over with the crowd? But very quickly he added, "But I yield to the judgment of the trustees and friends of the college, so far as I know it to have been expressed, and cheerfully attempt the experiment in reliance upon able coadjutors, upon the liberality of the friends of the college, and above all, on help from on high." Well, that help came from a more mundane source. If you can see this man, the name will ring a bell in any case, Samuel Williston of East Hampton, one of the wealthiest men in Western New England at the time, a button magnate of all things. And on the night before Edward Hitchcock's inauguration, Williston made a gift to the college of $20,000, the biggest gift that the college had ever received up to that point, all because of his confidence in Edward Hitchcock and, of course, his love of Amherst College. Several other big donors came forward in the next few months and years, and very shortly, the debt that the college had accrued had been erased. And years later, he wrote, "Oh, what a load did these benefactions take from my mind." Well, Edward Hitchcock and his family took up residence somewhat reluctantly in the president's house. Again, if you're from Amherst, you'll recognize that. And very quickly, he took steps to mend relations with students. Now, entertaining was not a skill that Edward Hitchcock had ever cultivated. He wasn't what we would call a party animal. But Aura was, it seems, and her social skills, her talents for organizing and running a household, and her boundless energy and optimism served as counterbalances to her husband's darker persona. As I write in my book, Aura was his anchor, his rudder, his keel. Without her steadying hand, her constancy, her faithfulness, his career would have had a very different trajectory. His life would likely have been shortened by decades, his soul buried in self-doubt and guilt. Well, the Hitchcocks immediately instituted a series of student receptions. They called them levees at the president's house, and that went over very well with students. And they became family affairs, as all the oldest of their children were now in their 20s, and all participated. Edward Jr. in particular, who was 17 at the time, recalls in his memoirs that I'll mention in a few minutes, these events with great color, humor, and enthusiasm. Another new initiative that you probably are familiar with was the mountain excursions. It was an idea he had borrowed from Mary Lyon at Mount Holyoke. In July of his first year as president, he led a group of students in constructing a pathway to the summit of Mount Holyoke, known today as Skinner State Park. When their labors were done and they descended, Miss Lyon and her students were ready at the bottom of the mountain with a picnic. And you can imagine how well that went over with the students, the Amherst students. Well, for the remainder of his presidency and for some years after his retirement, these excursions continued. And in many instances, the express purpose was the renaming of the mountain with a native name, such as Mount Norwottuck and Mount Pocumtuck. A bit of a kerfuffle occurred in 1849 when the students decided to rename Mount Toby Mount Mettawampi. But a few months later, the townspeople of Sunderland met and voted to reject the renaming of Toby and wrote a strong letter to the Hampshire and Franklin Express stating their objections. History tells us that the people of Sunderland prevailed, for as you know, that summit is known today not as Mount Mettawampi, but as Mount Toby. Throughout his years at Amherst College, Edward Hitchcock continued to preach in the chapel as well as in churches up and down the valley. Most of his sermons dealt with the basic tenets of Calvinism. Many also dealt with personal morality and warnings about sinful behavior such as sloth and drunkenness and excessive pride. And throughout his preaching career, and particularly late in life, he also preached on matters of social justice. And that included slavery, mistreatment of the American Indian, opposition to war, and temperance. Perhaps his most famous sermon is this one, as it was published, entitled "The Blind Slave in the Mines." It describes a very moving experience Hitchcock had deep in a Virginia coal mine in 1847, where he came upon an old blind man, a slave, laboring a half a mile below the surface, but singing a hymn about hope and redemption. "I shall be in heaven in the morning," he sang. It was Hitchcock's most popular sermon, and he was called upon to deliver it more than 20 times, and it was published in 1848, as you see there, by the American Tract Society. Well, Edward Hitchcock Jr. wrote a memoir that is it's never published, but it's in the archives at Amherst College, and I've transcribed it on my website. It's very entertaining, it's frank, it's funny, it's colorful, there's a lot of personal details. It's almost the exact opposite of his father's writing style. So I strongly recommend it if you're interested. And among the things he said that's amusing, he said, "My mother said more than once in my hearing that there were two things she would never do: to live in the president's house and to go to Europe. But she did both of them." And indeed, in the spring of 1850, at the urging of the trustees, Edward and Ora set out on a 6-month tour of Europe. Edward was reluctant. He was convinced that he and Ora would end up in a watery grave in the Atlantic. And he wrote, "So strong is the feeling," as he was preparing to depart, "so strong is the feeling as if I were preparing for my own funeral." But they went. They survived, and they spent 6 months touring around Europe, where they were wined and dined by the greatest scientists of Europe, minus, of course, the wine. While in Europe, Edward also undertook a survey of agricultural schools at the request of Massachusetts Governor Briggs, who had appointed him to a commission to look into that matter. And that had important consequences, which I'll get to in a few minutes. On their return from this 6-month absence, one of the most moving events, I think, of their lives, and I think you'll enjoy it the way I present it in the book, was their return to Amherst after 6-month absence. Because Edward was convinced that nobody cared that they were gone and nobody would notice their return. But as their carriage pulled up Amity Street in Amherst, this is what was written in the Gazette, the Hampshire Gazette. A procession of the various classes was in waiting at Amity Street for their arrival, which at his coming escorted the president to his residence on College Hill. A speech of welcome was here made by John E. Sanford, class of '51, which was fittingly responded to by President Hitchcock. The dormitories were brilliantly illuminated, and general congratulations at the doctor's return were expressed throughout the college. How many college presidents could expect that kind of a welcome after an extended absence? Not many, I would venture to guess. Well, in 1854, Edward Hitchcock resigned the presidency. We can sum it up by saying that in his 9 years, enrollment doubled. The debt was retired. 4 professorships were added. 2 cabinets were constructed. Those were for storage and display of the college's collections, and the Morgan Library was constructed, and perhaps most importantly of all, harmony was restored within the college. William S. Tyler, the college historian, wrote, "The value of Dr. Hitchcock's presidency to the institution cannot be overestimated. His weight of character and his wise policy saved the college." Well, the role of Edward Hitchcock in saving Amherst College is well known. Less well known is the important role he played in 2 other area institutions. First of all, Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which Mary Lyon founded in 1837 and which Edward and Ora supported. In fact, she lived with them for a time while she was making preparations for the opening of the college. She tutored several of their children, and all 4 of their girls attended Mount Holyoke. Edward was on the board of trustees from the day it was founded until the day of his death. Also, Edward was highly influential in the establishment of Massachusetts Agricultural College in 1867. He had been appointed to that committee while he was in that commission while he was in Europe. He had written a very long and very detailed report about his findings at agricultural schools in Ireland and in England and in Germany and Switzerland. And he began a campaign to lobby for the establishment of a state agricultural school in Massachusetts. I have not found anywhere where he advocated for locating it in Amherst. Perhaps he didn't feel that that was appropriate. But a few years after his death, the state legislature chartered Massachusetts Agricultural College, what we know today as University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And the people of Amherst rose up as a group and raised a large sum of money to make sure it was located in Amherst. And I think that we can have Edward Hitchcock to thank for the fact that UMass, the University of Massachusetts flagship campus is in Amherst and not in Westfield or Worcester or Lowell or something like that. Of course, the most important legacy of Edward Hitchcock relates to his research on the fossil footmarks of the Connecticut Valley. These were imprints of the tracks of ancient animals preserved in stone, and the first was brought to his attention in 1835. He immediately began to study them and published some 20 papers over the next 30 years in the American Journal of Science and other prominent publications on his findings. He was convinced that these were the tracks of animals, and to the best of his judgment, they were made by birds. They were so similar in so many respects to the tracks of modern day birds that he argued that that was the best explanation for them, that they were the tracks of ancient birds. Now, this was very controversial in several respects. First of all, they occurred in sandstone that would suggest that birds were present on Earth hundreds of millions of years earlier than paleontologists had previously believed. But even more strikingly, of course, some of these tracks were enormous, upwards of 18 inches long, even bigger than the tracks of an ostrich. That these were the tracks of ancient animals was largely accepted by the scientific communities in Europe and in North America. But his avian hypothesis was a harder sell. And he came under considerable criticism at his time and even into the 20th century. How unfortunate, said many critics, that Edward Hitchcock insisted on his avian hypothesis. But my research tells me, let me back up, my research tells me that he didn't really insist on it. He favored it, absolutely, because it was the best explanation he could find for the evidence he observed. But what he did insist upon again and again was that this was not the only possible explanation for these tracks. And I'll just point you to one of his comments on this that appeared in his book, landmark book, Ethnology of New England. He said, "I speak of those animals as certainly birds, though doubts sometimes cross one's minds on this point. And I am aware that with some distinguished zoologists, these doubts are strong. But I follow what seems to me at present the most probable view." Why, some critics asked, did he not recognize these as the tracks of dinosaurs? Why? For the simple reason that nobody knew anything about dinosaurs in his day, not as we know them. The word had been coined by this man, Sir Richard Owen, in 1841, but the creatures that word originally described would not have been capable of making those tracks. But today we know much more about dinosaurs, and especially in the last 50 years or so, a new view of dinosaurs has emerged. And what it tells us is that the dinosaurs of long ago were in fact the ancestors of modern day birds. Martin Lockley, if you can see him there, of the University of Colorado, wrote in 1991, "Hitchcock was right all along. The tracks were indeed those of special types of bird, not creatures identical to modern turkeys, but their ancient theropod ancestors. And Robert Baker, who's one of the most eminent dinosaur experts in this country today, has written, Hitchcock was the earliest and many ways the best mind in dinosaur science. All of us 21st century students of the dinosaur bird relations owe a tip of the hat toward the Reverend Edward Hitchcock. So Edward Hitchcock's reputation as a paleontologist has been resurrected. In his avian hypothesis, then, he was much more right than wrong. Edward Hitchcock's greatest ambition in life was to convince his fellow scientists, clergymen, and the general public that science and faith need not be antagonistic, that science should not be regarded as the enemy of religion. He wrote several dozens of scholarly papers on the subject, but in 1851, he published this book, The Religion of Geology. He regarded it as his most important work. And in that work, he said, the hostility between science and revelation is only apparent, not real. When rightly interpreted and understood, they will appear in perfect unison. Of course, the clash between science and religion came to a head just a few years near the end of Hitchcock's life with the publication of this book, The Origin of Species. At first, Edward Hitchcock argued strenuously against Darwinism on a number of religious points. So did many scientists of his day. But if you read Hitchcock's papers carefully in the last few years of his life, you see his thinking about Darwinism beginning to evolve, if we can use that term. He wrote in a paper in Bibliotheca Sacra, a theology journal in 1863, but after all, the real question is not whether these hypotheses accord with our religious views, but whether they are true. And later in the same article, he said, the fact that these new creations are repeated at intervals and seem to form a part of a series of operations which we know to be natural makes it quite probable that they also are natural. Perhaps this unknown law will by and by be discovered, as many new laws have been, to explain phenomena once supposed to be miraculous because anomalous and inexplicable. In other words, he was willing to keep the door open, to keep his mind open on the subject of evolution. Possibly, just possibly, the transmutation of species, natural selection, even human evolution were all part of God's plan. Now, some historians have labeled Edward Hitchcock as one of the last of the Christian geologists. But if that term is meant, by that term is meant someone who allows his religion to intrude upon and influence science, I don't think that's a fair assessment of Edward Hitchcock at all. For he found his own way of bridging the gap between science and faith. Far from being the last of a dying breed, he might well have been one of the first of a new breed of scientists that were comfortable with a world created by God, but regulated by the laws and principles of nature. There's a story told by one of Hitchcock's students that late in life, when he was starting a new term with one of his geology classes, the class met for the first time in a renovated building with a skylight that brought light into a room that had previously been entirely dark. On the first day, Professor Hitchcock stood before his students, looking up at the light streaming into the room, smiling, and said the following, which I think is the perfect summary of the fundamental principle of his life. Young gentlemen, all the light we have here comes from above. Okay, well, I will leave it there, except to remind you that I have a web page with a lot more information. I would particularly draw your attention to the Hitchcockiana, which is a blog that I add to periodically. I recently added something on the arrival of the railroad age in Amherst. And also, I think I've solved the mystery of Ora's mother, Ruth Sherman White. She's not buried with the rest of her family, but I found her grave in a rather unexpected place for an interesting reason. You'll also find much about the ancestors of, or descendants, I should say, of Edward and Ora, including, of course, Dr. Edward Hitchcock Jr., who actually taught at Amherst College for a lot longer than his father did, 50 years. Charles, who was a geologist who taught at Dartmouth for 40 years. Emily Hitchcock Terry, a very accomplished botanical artist, spent the last 25 of her years of her life as a house mother at Smith College. Jane Elizabeth Hitchcock was a very, very a well-known pioneer in the field of community nursing at the turn of the century. And Dr. John Sawyer Hitchcock was the personal physician of Calvin Coolidge. And but also he was the head of the infectious disease unit of the Massachusetts Department of Health during the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic. In the corner there, but Margaret Hitchcock Emerson. Some of you may have known Margaret because she worked at Amherst College right up to toward the end of her life, and she was an archivist. She was, I think, the first archivist at the college to curate her great-great-grandfather's and grandmother's papers. And also, I think you will especially enjoy reading about a meeting I had with these two modern day Hitchcocks, great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Edward and Ora. That's Emily Hitchcock, a graduate of Smith, and Sawyer, a graduate of Ithaca College. And it was a great pleasure to meet and talk with them a few weeks ago and to know how they treasure their famous ancestors. You may be particularly interested to learn that both are involved in sustainable agriculture, a pursuit that I believe their famous ancestors would applaud. I think you'd agree with that. I hope you will read my book if you haven't already done so. I think you'll find it offers an intimate view of Edward and Ora based largely on original sources, letters, diaries, and so on. As I've mentioned, every chapter begins with a vignette, a scene with dialogue based on real events. And I hope also that it will give you a sense of what it was like to live in this valley 200 or so years ago. Its agriculture and industry, transportation, community life, a real picture of Amherst of 2 centuries ago. Here's that list that I promised of other organizations and institutions that I am indebted to. And now, with George's help, I'd be happy to take your questions or comments. So I'm gonna.
And I had a question, perhaps a little off topic, but why did Ora not want to go to Europe? Do you know?
Well, I suppose for the same reasons that Edward did. She was fearful of the trip, and the trip was miserable for them both. They were both sick the whole time. So their fears in that regard were borne out. Other than that, I don't know. I'm sure she expected to miss her children. And she wrote to them very, very regularly on the trip. So that's just a guess.
I know that people did travel to Europe. I know that many people with academic careers, they might have gone to graduate school in Germany. They might travel to conferences in Europe. So, you know, historically, 19th century America, there were strong connections with the European academic community.
The voyage was 12 days, so it was a long excursion.
Mm-hmm.
But yep, it was being done all the time.
As I say,
I do have a question.
Mr. Lee, okay.
I wondered if you could. My computer didn't cooperate for about 5 minutes, so I missed something in the middle, and you may have already covered it. But could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Hitchcocks, both Edward and Ora and Mary Lyon, and how that developed and how he was involved with Mount Holyoke?
Well, yes. Mary and Ora became friends when Ora had Mary as a student at Amherst Academy. That would have been 1819. They kept up their friendship for the next, the rest of Mary's life. Mary died fairly young. When Mary started looking around for locations for her female seminary, as she called it, she frequently stayed with the Hitchcocks, first in Conway, as I understand, because of course Mary was born in Buckland, right next door to Conway, so that was familiar territory to her. And then in Amherst, as I mentioned, she tutored several of the Hitchcock children while she was living with them in 1835 and 1836. And there are some very touching letters from the children to her when she went away. And then Edward became one of the founding trustees of the college in 1837. And as I mentioned, maybe you heard it, all four of their daughters attended Mount Holyoke, or actually drew a design for a logo, I guess you'd call it today, for the college. And they kept up their affiliate. And actually both Edward Jr. and Charles taught, and Edward Sr. too, taught sort of as adjunct lecturers at Mount Holyoke for a time as well. Mary sadly passed away in 1849 at quite a young age, and Edward wrote one of those biographies of her. So they had a long-standing, close relationship. Edward was a champion of women's education and particularly of higher education, although not in the same college and preferably not in the same town with the men, as you could see.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah. David's father, by the way, if I can add one more note, was Dean Lee. Am I right, David? And he was the author
that's right.
of one of the histories of Conway that I used in my research. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, well, thank you. It's really an excellent presentation, Robert. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Other questions? I still don't see anything in the chat. So I suppose we thank you for your talk, and
Great.
so thank you very much.
Good, thanks.